Right now, somewhere in your day, you've already done it. Maybe you took a name in vain. Maybe you envied a neighbour. Maybe you ate something you weren't supposed to, on a day you weren't supposed to, with a person you weren't supposed to be with. To you, none of it matters. You'll forget it by tomorrow. But 700 years ago, any one of these small things could have started a process that ended with your bare feet on cold stone, a candle in your hand, and an entire village watching you weep. In medieval Europe, a sinner was not a private matter. Sin was a public account, like a tax debt or a court summons. It had a price, and every man, woman, and child in Christendom owed, but how that debt was collected, what it looked like, what it sounded like, what it smelled like, almost no one alive today understands. So let's go back to the beginning and see what really happened to a sinner in the Middle Ages. For most of the early medieval period, sin was something you handled alone with a priest. You confessed in a whisper. You did your penance in private, but by the 600s, that began to change. Irish monks started writing books called penitentials. These were not theology, they were bureaucracy. They were spreadsheets of the soul. The most famous of them, the Penitential of Cummian, written around the year 650, listed every sin a human being could commit and assigned a specific punishment for each: gluttony, 7 days of bread and water; drunkenness until you vomited, 30 days; striking a fellow monk in anger, 40 days; killing a man, 10 years of exile; fasting and prayer. Each sin had a price tag, each soul had a balance sheet. By the 11th century, a German bishop named Burchard of Worms had expanded the system in a book called The Corrector. It covered things you cannot imagine the church taking the time to list: whispering about your neighbour's wife, wearing the wrong clothes during Lent, singing the wrong song in the wrong month, working on a Sunday after the bells had rung. Each had its assigned penance, its day count, its required prayers. Sin was no longer between you and God. Sin was a number in a book, and the heavier your number, the more you would have to do in front of everyone you knew. This is what most modern people get wrong about medieval punishment. We picture torture chambers and dungeons. The real horror was quieter and slower and far more public. The most common punishment for sin was not pain, it was humiliation. In towns across England, France and Germany, sinners performed what was called the white sheet penance. You would arrive at the church door on a Sunday morning, the entire parish watching. You wore nothing but a long white shift. You were barefoot, even in winter. In your hand, a thin yellow candle. The priest read your offence aloud, every detail, in front of your neighbours, your in-laws, your children. You would walk 3 times around the church, weeping, and beg forgiveness at each corner. Then you would lie face down on the stone in front of the altar for the entire Mass. This could last weeks. Some sinners performed the white sheet every Sunday for a year, some for the rest of their lives. Records from English church courts in the 1300s show parishioners doing this for adultery, for gossip, for refusing to pay tithes, for missing too many masses, for sleeping with the wrong cousin, for eating meat on a Friday. You did not just lose your dignity, you lost your standing. Your daughter would not be married, your son would not be hired, your name became a punchline at the tavern, and you had asked for it, because not doing the penance was worse. If you refused, you were excommunicated, and excommunication was the closest thing the medieval world had to being erased. An excommunicated person could not enter a church, could not receive the sacraments, could not be buried in consecrated ground, which meant their soul was understood by everyone, including themselves, to be heading directly to hell. Their friends could not eat with them, their family could not speak to them, trades refused to serve them. In some regions, even touching an excommunicate was itself a sin that required its own penance. They walked through their own villages as ghosts. In 1077, this happened to a king. Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe, had picked a fight with Pope Gregory VII over who got to appoint bishops. The Pope excommunicated him. Within months, Henry's nobles began to drift away. The empire began to crack, so in the dead of winter, Henry crossed the Alps. He arrived at the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where the Pope was staying. He was not allowed in. For 3 days, the emperor of half of Europe stood outside the castle gate in the snow. He wore the wool shirt of a penitent. He was barefoot. He did not eat. He stood there in front of every traveller and every servant who walked past and waited. On the 4th day, the Pope let him in and lifted the excommunication. Henry had won, technically, but the image of an emperor freezing in the snow to be forgiven became the most famous picture in medieval Europe of what sin could do to you. If a king had to stand barefoot in the snow, what did you think was waiting for you? A century later, a different king, Henry II of England, walked the streets of Canterbury in nothing but a wool shirt after the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket. 80 monks took turns flogging him at the cathedral door. He spent the night on the stone floor of the crypt without food, without sleep, without sitting. He was the King of England. He was being whipped by men he could have hanged. If this was what happened to kings, you can imagine what happened to the rest. For the poor, the system was faster and it was bloodier. In thousands of cases across medieval Europe, when a person was accused of a serious sin and the evidence was unclear, they were not put on trial in any way we would recognise. They were put through an ordeal. The most common was the hot iron. You would carry a glowing iron bar, roughly the weight of a small loaf of bread, for 9 paces. Your hand was then bound in cloth and sealed by a priest. 3 days later, the bandage was removed. If the wound was clean, you were innocent. If it was festering, God had spoken. You were guilty. You were sentenced. Then there was cold water. The accused was bound, the right thumb tied to the left big toe, the left thumb to the right big toe. A priest blessed the water, the body was lowered in. If you sank, the holy water had accepted you, and you were innocent, and they pulled you out sometimes. If you floated, the water had rejected you, and you were guilty. We still use the phrase today without knowing where it came from. When someone's story doesn't add up, we say it won't hold water. These ordeals were not rare. They were the standard legal procedure in much of Europe for almost 400 years. They were performed in churches, blessed by priests, recorded in royal documents. The wound or the float was understood, not as physics, but as the literal voice of God. And for the worst sins, the ones that could not be wiped away with penance or sackcloth or shame, there was the pyre. In 1209, the Pope declared a crusade against fellow Christians for the first time in history. The target was a sect of dissenters in southern France called the Cathars, who had decided the material world was evil and that the Roman Church had it wrong. When crusaders arrived at the city of Béziers, where Cathars and Catholics lived side by side, a commander was asked how to tell them apart. The chronicler Caesarius of Heisterbach records his answer: kill them all. God will know his own. Around 20,000 people were killed in a single day. 35 years later, the last great Cathar stronghold at Montségur surrendered. 220 of their spiritual leaders, called the Perfecti, were given a choice: renounce your faith or burn. They walked singing into a pyre built at the base of the mountain. The field is still called the Prat dels Cremats, the field of the burned. In 1415, the reformer Jan Hus was burned at Constance for teaching that the church should be poor and that the Bible alone, not the Pope, was authority. In 1431, a 19-year-old peasant girl named Joan was burned at Rouen for, among other charges, wearing men's clothes. The fire took her twice. The first burn killed her. The second, ordered by the executioner, reduced what was left so completely that no one could claim a piece of her body as a relic. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine. A medieval sinner was not punished. A medieval sinner was made into a lesson. The white sheet was a lesson. The barefoot king was a lesson. The bound body in the water was a lesson. The pyre was a lesson. The point was never the body of the sinner. The point was every other body watching. And here is where it gets strange. We tell ourselves we abolished all of this. We tell ourselves we live in a secular age. We do not believe in sin anymore. We do not put people in stocks. We do not march them around churches in shifts. We do not light fires. But every instinct that built that world is still inside us. When a stranger does something wrong on the internet and 1 million people pile on and their name is screamed across every feed and their employer is contacted and their face is everywhere for a week and they are removed from their job, from their friendships, from their public life, that is not a new thing. That is the white sheet penance with a glass screen instead of a candle. The accused stands in a digital square, the neighbours gather, the offence is read aloud, the crowd decides. When a public figure is cancelled, that is excommunication in a society that swears it doesn't believe in excommunication anymore. When someone confesses on camera, weeping, listing everything they did, asking forgiveness from people they have never met, that is the penitential of Cummian, rewritten in a new language. Sin is still a public account. We still keep ledgers. They are just stored on servers now. Researchers who study online shaming have found that the dynamics follow almost the exact arc that anthropologists describe for shame rituals in pre-modern societies. The same crowd, the same escalation, the same need on the part of the watchers to be seen watching, to be on the right side of the fire. We did not abandon the medieval mind, we just lost the priest. The structure is still in us. The instinct to find a sinner, name them, parade them, and burn them, whether the burning is real or symbolic, has not gone anywhere. It is one of the oldest reflexes our species knows. The Middle Ages did not invent it. They only built the most elaborate machine for it the world has ever seen. And here is the thing the medieval church understood that we have forgotten. The sinner was always us. The man in the white sheet was your neighbour last month, and he might be you next month. The point of the ritual was not to separate the good from the wicked. It was to remind every person in the parish that they were one whisper, one wrong meal, one wrong night away from being the one in the shift. The candle was passed around. The fire was always lit. The only question was whose turn it was to stand in front of it. For most of 1,000 years, the people of Europe lived inside that question every day. They woke up knowing the village was watching. They went to sleep knowing God was. They counted their days in fast days and feast days, in confessions made and confessions skipped, in sins committed and sins forgiven, with a precision that would feel insane to a modern mind. But you have not escaped that world. You are still standing in front of the same fire. You just call it something else now.